Hello, everyone, and it's good to be back with you for this adult Bible study lesson that's for November the 8th. Today, we're going to be looking at a passage from Luke as we continue in our unit that's titled In This Place. Last week we looked at four different Old Testament passages where different patriarchs, different uh, prominent people in the Jewish faith had situations where they built altars and worshiped God and thanked Him for His perseverance and His love and grace and getting them through it. We looked at Noah, we looked at Samuel, we looked at several people that had that opportunity significant happen between themselves and God, and to leave that mark for others to be able to look at Jesus, those places where we would expect our worship to really and our focus on worship to be looking at very closely. In Luke, what we find, we're looking at the fourth chapter for today's lesson, but before you get to the fourth chapter, you have Luke presenting Jesus being baptized, his beginning his ministry, his being tempted by the devil, and just prior to the verses that we're going to look at today, he begins and healing and just really beginning that direct ministry of God's calling and that response of God's calling in his life. What we find in chapter 4, which again is just preceding this lesson for today, it said, Jesus returned to Galilee. This is immediately after his being tempted by the devil. He ends that section there with saying to the devil, do not put the Lord your God to the test. And it's something that we all need to remember is testing God is not appropriate. And certainly the devil here had been testing Jesus. Jesus stood that test. He did so much better than I do, so much better than most of us do when it comes to those tests that life throws at us. But Jesus authenticated his calling and authenticated his power and his authority. Authority is a really key thing in the Gospel of Luke. And so we want to keep that in mind too, that Luke is really trying to underline Jesus' authority to speak in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. Later it goes on, he went to Nazareth after that, and he says, there where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue as was his custom. There again, that's pinpointing the significance of this place of worship. It was Jesus's custom to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath day to teach and to fellowship and to worship together with other people. And so that was a rightful place for his to begin his ministry. In this particular section of verses, Jesus is handed on me because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. What a wonderful summation of Jesus's call and ministry and purpose in going to the people and sharing the good news, the gospel of himself and of God's love and grace. As he spoke these words, as he expounded on this passage, at first the people responded very warmly and they said, isn't this Joseph's son? And it was kind of like, wow, he's pretty good. And then he said some things that they didn't like. It looks to me like the main inference, the thing that they probably didn't like about what he said, was he made it clear that the gospel, the good news of God's love and grace, was not just for Jewish people. And they really bristled at that. In fact, they bristled at it so much that they rose up to run him out of town. And this is the issue, the scene where the crowd gathers around him and Jesus just walks through the crowd and goes on his way because he realizes that he's not going to be able to be effective there. And that's where we get that passage about a prophet can't be understood and accepted as a prophet in his own area. It's tough sometimes to come back to an area where people knew you as a young person. I think Reed Crotty was one of those folks that had that special ability to be able to come back and to really enhance his ministry at Bluff Park by the fact that he had grown up in that area, and that a lot of people in that area were people who knew him from early on. And that certainly is the exceptional situation, and a part of what made Reed such a dear and special pastor for our church. Jesus, on the other hand, didn't find that kind of warm reception. In fact, the people were very critical, and the Jewish people seem to have been very critical anyway. I mean, they really took sincerely their need to test these people who came in the sense of declaring themselves as the Messiah. And unfortunately, at this time in history, there were a lot of people that were doing that. Jesus was not alone in this, and so it wasn't like the people were just cold-hearted. They had been misled several times. They had been burnt, so to speak. They had listened to some of these people who had tried to gather groups of people and form a rebellion and against the Romans, and then the rebellion would be put down, and they would see that that person's leadership was not godly, was not God ordained and God supported. And so Jesus coming and starting his ministry is kind of like, oh no, here's another one. And so it's kind of like, show me, kind of like, we're from Missouri, you got to show us. But Jesus does show them, doesn't he? He begins his ministry and he does some wonderful things that authenticate his authority and his power and the fact that God has ordained him in his ministry. And that's what we see in the passage for today. Let's look at it. Here in Luke, the 4th chapter, we find that verse 31, Jesus he went from Nazareth down to the city of Capernaum in Galilee and taught the people each Sabbath. This was not something he did just on one occasion, but he had done it repetitively. They were amazed by his teaching because he delivered his message with authority. That's a good authenticator, isn't it? Of a pastor, of a teacher, of someone, that they have a sense of authority about what they say. They have a sense of conviction. I tried one time as a young man to be a door-to-door salesman. And one of the things I learned early on, well, I was selling something that was a reasonably good product, and yet I still had my own thoughts about whether it was valid and whether it was something that people did. As a salesman, being able to go to somebody's door and say, "Have I got something for you?" Jesus, on the other hand, came to the people and he says, "My Father has sent me, and I have a message for you direct from God." He didn't use those words specifically, but he spoke with that sense of other people to authenticate his words, but he spoke with power and authority, and his authority came from the truthfulness of his words. When he said things, people listened, and when they thought through those things, they thought his authority. But that's not the only thing that he did, not the only way that his authority was authenticated in this passage. It says, a man in the synagogue had the spirit of an unclean demon. He screamed, "Hey, what have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One from God." Now, why would a demon do that? Why would someone who is possessed do that? Well, it was thought that to know a person's name, to be able to speak to them directly and to be able to acknowledge who they are. You can't fool me. I know who you are. And Jesus says, I'm not trying to fool you. As a matter of fact, I don't want you to be giving people a false idea about who I am. And so he told the demon to be silent. Silence, Jesus said in verse 35, speaking harshly to the demon. Jesus didn't say, shh, be quiet. He said, be silent. That's not helpful for them. Then came out of him without harming him. The demon couldn't harm the man because he was in Jesus' care. And the demon came out. Demons, that's a strange thought for us today in our time, isn't it? We don't think a whole lot about demons unless maybe it's a Hollywood movie and a horror story or something that's made to kind of entice our imaginations and that sort of thing. And yet in Jesus' day, it was ability to blame evil things upon, to blame poor health, to blame poor circumstances, to blame anything that was negative and out of the ordinary upon. And so it was, they would say the devil did it, or there's a demon inside this person. This person's got problems. And in our day, we can look or can identify, would have been identified as someone who was demon possessed because they're really not into their clear, rational mind. They're not able to express themselves. And some of the things they say and some of the things they respond to are not things that other people can. And so you look for an excuse. And in Jesus' day, that excuse was demons. In our day, we know that we understand mental illness a little bit more. We understand disease and the disease process a little bit more. We understand that things like a plague or things like a illness that we're going through right now is not a curse against a specific person or people as much as it is a biological process. And yes, there are some things maybe sometimes that we do that make ourselves more vulnerable to this, but it's not that we're directly being punished by that. On the other hand, we don't want to be so highfalutin and scientific and dogmatic about, that's just hearsay, that we discount the fact that there is definitely evil in the world. And as God's people, worship for us is one of those ways that we stand in strong contradiction against the evil that does exist in our world. We may not refer to that evil as demonic, but nonetheless, we realize that there are things that are not right. We realize there are people who act in ways that are not appropriate and who do that for self-serving, self-centered kind of reasons. And that's evil. That's not good. It's not for their good or for anyone else's good in the long run. And so when we worship, as in this case, and there is that influence of evil, Jesus rebukes that evil. And that's a part of our worship, is to be able to push aside those evil things of our world and to be able to regain our focus on good things, on Jesus' grace, on God's love and power. And that way we're able to face those things as we encounter them day by day in our everyday lives. We said to each other, what kind of word is this? That he has commanded unclean spirits with authority and power, and they leave. Reports about him spread everywhere in the surrounding region. You can see how what we've just talked about demons and the thought of demons and that as a rationale would authenticate Jesus because he was empowered to heal. But he didn't just heal in this sense. He healed in the sense of letting people know that God had mercy and God understands and God wants us to be whole and healthy, even though that full wholeness and full healthiness is something that we can only achieve in everlasting with him. Let's see. After leaving the synagogue, Jesus, this is continuing on in verse 38, it says, after leaving the synagogue, Jesus went home with Simon. Simon's mother-in-law was sick with a high fever, and the family asked Jesus to help her. He bent over her and spoke harshly to the fever. There again, spoke harshly, spoke firmly, spoke with authority against the fever, and it left her. God has that ability to heal and that ability to make us whole again. She got up at once and served them. You know, when I get over an illness, it takes me a day or two to get back on my feet again. I've kind of lost a lot of strength and lost a lot of focus, and I just have to kind of get things going again. But this woman was able to jump right back into her daily routine and normal lifestyle. It was truly a God-given gift of healing, and that authenticated Jesus. In fact, so much so that as the rest of our passage goes on, it says, when the sun was setting, everyone brought to Jesus relatives and acquaintances with all kinds of diseases. Placing his hands on each of them, he healed them. Demons also came out of many people. They screamed, "You are God's son." But he spoke harshly to them and wouldn't allow them to speak because they recognized that he was Christ. When daybreak arrived, Jesus went to a deserted place. The crowds were looking for him, and when they found him, they tried to keep him from leaving them. But he said to them, "I must preach the good news of God's kingdom to other cities too, for this is why I was sent." So he continued preaching in the Judean synagogues. Can't you put yourself in these people's place in Capernaum? Here has come a teacher who's touched your mind and who's touched your heart, who has been a source of healing and empowerment to those who are helpless and unable to do things for themselves. And what a marvelous gift that is to be in his presence. And yet God is not just ours, is he? He belongs to everyone, and his love is for everyone. And Jesus makes that manifest, understood to the people. He says, I'm not here just for you, though I am here for you, and I do care for you, and my Father cares for you. But there are others who need to hear the good news as well. That emphasizes to me and to you how worship is something that, as Jesus saw his ministry being not just there in Capernaum, but to the world, and to reach out to as many people as possible in that 3-year period of his ministry that he was going to have. Jesus understood when we worship, we have a sense of God's presence and empowerment and authority and authentication that brings us into his presence, and it's a wonderful time. And just like those people in the Old Testament that we looked at last week, we want to set up a monument. We want to mark that place. That's why our sanctuary is so special to us, because we have encountered God there. But it's not just about encountering God there. It's about taking that encounter with God and sharing it with others who haven't had such an encounter themselves. Enter to worship, depart to serve. A lot of churches put that in their church bulletin, and I think it's a very good commission. Enter to worship, depart to serve. Praise be to God that we worship together in the synagogues and in the temples and in the churches and the sanctuaries of our world. And because of that, we are empowered to continue that ministry that is his to everyone, all the way around the world and in every situation. God bless you this week. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I hope this message has been in the world, and not to be naive about that, but also at the same time not to be caught up in that so much that you fail to see the good things and the wonderful things of God's grace and love. And have a great week.